I'm Eleanor Wachtel, and this is the Arts Today. Tonight, our London theatre critic talks about the latest roles from Jude Law and Kenneth Branagh. And women in jazz. Just how far, or not, have they come? Canadian saxophonist Jane Bonnet from her recording of Thelonious Monk's Break's Sake. Jane Bonnet was one of a number of jazz musicians and scholars who met in San Francisco last week for a series of concerts, films, and discussion called Jazz Women. James Hale is a music critic and the Canadian correspondent for Downbeat magazine. He was at the event, and he joins me now from Ottawa to talk about one of the main issues discussed, gender discrimination in jazz. Hi.
Hi, Eleanor. It's nice to be here.
Nowadays, with women like Jane Bonnet, Rini Rosnes, and others recording and performing internationally, is sexism in jazz still an issue, or is it more of an historical concern?
Well, it's really both. When you look back over the 100-year history of jazz, you can't help but think about the colorful, larger-than-life characters who made the music. People like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Thelonious Monk, Miles Davis. And there's a large supporting cast of musicians in the history books and films on jazz, but the list is almost exclusively male. When you think about women in jazz who have made their mark, the list is dominated by vocalists, whether it's Bessie Smith in the formative years, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, or even today with Diana Krall and Cassandra Wilson. I think most people would have a difficult time naming even a handful of women instrumentalists, and yet there have always been women who have been first-rate players. Musicians like Lil Hardin, Mary Lou Williams, Mary Osborne, and Vi Red. They just don't get their due. And today, you're more likely to see a jazz magazine sporting a provocative photograph of Diana Krall on the cover than you are of any women who play drums, trumpet, or sax.
So how did this event in San Francisco address the issue?
Well, this series, which, by the way, is staged by the non-profit SF Jazz organization, which also runs the San Francisco Jazz Festival, it took three approaches. It showcased the diversity of some of the most talented women working in jazz today, including Jane Bonnet, another Canadian trumpeter Ingrid Jensen, composer Maria Schneider, drummer Susie Abera, pianist Marilyn Crispell, and Cassandra Wilson. The second thing it did was to celebrate some of the great women of the past with a number of archival films showing just how talented they were. And the third thing was a panel discussion looking at why more women haven't made it into the history books, or more importantly perhaps into the record collection of jazz fans.
Who was on the panel?
It included Maria Schneider, Susie Abera, a San Francisco pianist called Mary Watkins, and Professor Sherry Tucker, who has written about the all-women bands of the 1940s. And moderating the panel was Angela Davis, a woman who has become a real icon in the Bay Area since the 1970s when she was a radical professor and a vocal supporter of the Black Panther Party. More recently, Davis has written extensively about women in society. And here's Angela Davis outlining the key issue in the topic of women in jazz.
Jazz has sometimes been characterized as the last art form to recognize the significance of feminism. At the beginning of the 21st century, jazz women are still considered the exception. Even though there are vast numbers of women of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds playing jazz, and playing jazz on every instrument in every genre, women continue to be purged from the jazz imagination, except as vocalists and perhaps as piano players.
Why do you think that is? I mean, given that jazz ostensibly is about innovation and individualism.
Well, I think that's the central irony in this entire issue. And jazz is supposed to be about, communication and democracy. And in fact, Angela Davis refers to jazz as the great American democratic meeting place. After all, when you think about it, jazz developed as a meeting ground for the races. It was formally integrated long before other major cultural institutions like professional baseball. And informally, blacks and whites have been creating jazz together since its earliest years. But women have always had very limited roles. They weren't offered gigs. They weren't offered recording contracts. So subsequently, they didn't get to develop as collaborators. And what ended up happening in the 30s and 40s, as Sherry Tucker looks at in her book, is they were forced into segregated groups, which are usually run by men. Groups like the Sweethearts of Rhythm or Ina Ray Hutton's Melodiers, and by the way, that's spelled Melodears, Dears. And they did films like Focus on Girls. And consequently, younger women who were coming up then in the 50s and into the 60s, they had no role models to follow. So there was lots of discussion at this panel last week about gender typing and the importance of early imprinting on girls. And composer Maria Schneider believes that young girls traditionally receive the wrong kinds of messages. And boys, she says, are encouraged to create while girls are encouraged to please other people.
In order to develop, especially in jazz, you have to be so selfish with your time. You have to know what it is to sit in a practice room or to compose or to play. You have to know what it is to love that and to spend a whole day there and go home and just feel so good to have been alone doing what you do. And that's something I believe that is much more natural to most men than it is to most women because of those early messages we have when we're a child. Because the girl at a very young age gets distracted about what people are thinking about her, so she's always putting her energy out to other places, where the boy is sitting in that practice room developing his music or his art or whatever it is he's doing.
But the thing of it is that this would be true of any art form. Why do you think jazz is particularly backward in this regard in relation to women?
Well, I think it is that the lack of role models and the fact that jazz is so competitive and it has become sort of a boys' club, and breaking into that boys' club mentality is pretty difficult. Mind you, there are other musicians who believe that things are changing, and that this sort of boys' club mentality is more almost a protective structure because jazz is so competitive. The trumpeter Ingrid Jensen, who's originally from Nanaimo, BC, however, holds the opinion that hearing is believing, that once the boys hear you play, doesn't matter who you are or where you come from, that you can break through the stereotypes. And she's had a pretty unique experience coming from Canada, playing a trumpet, which is traditionally viewed as a male instrument, and breaking into a field that is predominantly African American.
That experience is a drag. There's always that resistance there when anything is unknown. And if a white chick walks in with her trumpet, the first thing all the brothers and non-brothers who've been hanging with the brothers and the boys club are going to think is that she can't play. But she sure is cute, man. Maybe we can get her in bed, And that's I swear that's probably the number one reflex and reaction, and it's perfectly natural for people to react that way. Is to think that if you look like I look, you're not going to sound like I sound. That's weird, and it's taken a while, I think, for people to let go of the image. Even still, with me, when I play, I can only speak from my own experience, really. That it's just about the music. Again, it's just about the sound coming out of the end and how much that adds to the musical situation.
James, did the rise of the feminist movement in the 1970s have much of an impact on women in jazz?
Well, you started to see some changes in the 70s with band leaders like Toshiko Akiyoshi and Carla Bley. But really, it wasn't until the 80s when female soloists and band leaders like Jane Bennett began to emerge. But even so, Jane Bennett told me last week she still hears that there's a quota system. She still gets the response when she calls to play at a festival. We already have our woman headliner booked. And she actually says, she also hears that about Cuban musicians who she works with, and she said she doesn't know, which is more insulting, whether it's because they already have a woman booked or because they already have the Cuban, thing covered. And but she still hears that today.
And Toshiko Akiyoshi and Carla Bley, what do they do?
Toshiko Akiyoshi, was a band leader, and she, like Jane, worked with her husband, Lou Tabakan, became fairly well established in the 70s and 80s as the big band in New York City, and traveled widely, won a lot of the jazz polls. Carla Bley, whose surname comes from being married to the Canadian pianist Paul Bley, also worked with big bands and composed a lot of pieces that started to get played by male players. So their music started to become more widely accepted. So the consensus, I think, among the musicians anyway, is that it'll probably take another generation of young musicians to really change it. Ingrid Jensen sees some encouraging signs, though.
So what I see is this new generation of kids, 20 and under, or 21 and under, who they don't care if their friend is gay. They don't care if the drummer in their band is a lesbian. They just want to play, and they want to play the music, and that's what I see is happening. And the future is there's a lot of young people who are really getting the music, girls and boys, and they're really getting good at a really young age. It's really scary, good scary, and I think that we're going to see that in the next 5 or 10 years that there are these people who have a voice, and it's only going to be more and more beautiful and more exciting to see that energy come into play.
Did the women who took part in the panel discussion share her optimism?
I think some of the others were less optimistic. Mary Watkins particularly, she's a veteran pianist and a composer, and she's worked in the music for a long time, and she really believes that systemic changes are required to change things.
Playing jazz, being a jazz musician is not easy for anybody. It's not easy for men, and and I think it's a little harder for women because of our social structures. And the society doesn't really support musicians a whole lot. If you teach, okay, good. But if you're out there as a jazz musician, there's not a lot of money to support jazz, and women are generally have a little bit harder time. There are props that aren't there for women. It is better. I agree. It is better. But these are things that that we have to remember. It's not yet quite like it ought to be. It's got to get better.
Angela Davis is really even less optimistic. She ties the failure of women to make any real movement in jazz to societal changes around the world, and she believes that really changes throughout society are needed to improve the situation for women in jazz.
If women's place in jazz has a promising future, we will have to think in more complicated political and transnational terms. It should not be a question of asking male jazz musicians to move over and make a little space for women to squeeze in. Rather, it should be about new musical and political imaginations and new social worlds.
James, how do you think that kind of societal change that Angela Davis speaks of can be achieved?
Well, I think, as Ingrid Jensen says, certainly we're seeing it just by people breaking down stereotypes, whether they be traditional gender stereotypes or sexual stereotypes, and just opening things up more. And I think, we see it throughout society, and younger people being more broad-minded and open-minded, and I think that will help bring the change through into jazz as well.
I've been speaking with James Hale, music critic and the Canadian correspondent for Downbeat magazine. James, thanks very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Now here's some music from trumpeter Ingrid Jensen, a piece called Dear John.